In the collective imagination, a young actress of serene appearance and intellectual background is usually associated with stability, control, and distance from the chaos of the entertainment world. Her public image conveys discipline, discretion, and an almost academic relationship with art. However, behind that carefully constructed facade, a much more fragile story is sometimes hidden, marked by prolonged silences, inexplicable absences, and a pain that never found a legitimate space to be expressed. For months, the name of a Chinese actress began to appear intermittently in digital conversations charged with unease. It was not about a new project, nor a confirmed scandal, but something much more disturbing: the sensation that something was not right. Scattered comments spoke of uncontrollable weeping, of constant fear, of a life that seemed reduced to extreme caution. For the public, accustomed to consuming clear stories and closed narratives, these ambiguous signals were deeply disturbing. The turning point arrived when the sudden passing of a young actor, with whom she had been linked professionally and emotionally in the past, reactivated old images and memories. Photographs of a shared stage, joint musical performances, and glances that, in retrospect, seemed to say more than was perceived at the time. The tragedy not only shook the followers of the deceased actor, but also projected an even denser shadow over those who had formed part of his closest circle. From that moment on, accounts began to circulate attempting to fill the informational voids. Some spoke of entire nights of crying, others of progressive isolation. The absence of official statements, far from calming the mood, amplified the uncertainty. In the digital ecosystem, where silence is usually interpreted as implicit confirmation of the worst, the lack of answers became the perfect fuel for speculation. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms actually drive this type of crisis? How is a narrative of fear constructed when information is fragmentary and power operates beyond the public's reach? Analyzing this case does not imply affirming or denying versions, but observing how the machinery of entertainment functions when a public figure seems to be trapped between external expectations, invisible pressures, and an environment that rarely prioritizes emotional health over profitability. This story is not limited to the possible relationship between two artists, nor to the tragedy of a premature loss. It is, above all, a reflection of how the system responds when a person ceases to fit into the image expected of them. From the first signs of vulnerability to the irreversible consequences of media exposure, every detail reveals a structure that rewards obedience and penalizes fragility. Throughout this analysis, we will examine the roots of this crisis, the role of institutional silence, and the reaction of an audience that oscillates between compassion and suspicion. Not to pass judgment, but to understand how, in the world of contemporary entertainment, the line between private life and public narrative can disappear completely, leaving the real person trapped in a story they no longer control. Subscribe to the channel to find justice for Yu Menglong. Each of your subscriptions will help add one vote to the petition for Yu Menglong's protections. The origin of a crisis is rarely found in a single visible event. More frequently, it forms slowly, in overlapping layers of pressure, unspoken expectations, and imposed silences. In the case of certain young figures in entertainment, the conflict does not arise when the public starts talking, but much earlier, when everything still seems to be under control. The entertainment industry in China is characterized by a rigid hierarchical structure, where early success does not always translate into real autonomy. For an actress with an academic profile, a lover of music and art, entering this system usually implies a constant negotiation between personal identity and commercial image. Every public gesture is observed, every word measured, every relationship evaluated according to its strategic utility. In that environment, discretion ceases to be a choice and becomes a necessity for survival. From the outside, her trajectory seemed exemplary. Calculated appearances, selective projects, absence of scandals. However, those who observe closely know that the lack of noise does not always indicate stability. On many occasions, it is the symptom of permanent surveillance. Living with caution, avoiding conflicts, not expressing strong opinions, and maintaining a submissive attitude regarding the decisions of third parties are behaviors that, although normalized, generate sustained psychological tension. Professional relationships, in this context, acquire disproportionate emotional weight. When two young artists coincide on a stage, collaborate on a musical interpretation, or share moments of public exposure, a bond is created that goes beyond work. Not necessarily romantic, but certainly based on the mutual understanding of shared pressure. Intellectual affinity, common interest in art, and sensitivity to the environment can generate a sensation of temporary refuge within an industry that rarely offers safe spaces. The sudden death of one of these actors broke that fragile balance. Beyond the human loss, the psychological impact was profound. For those who remained, the implicit message was clear: no one is untouchable. Grief, instead of being experienced privately and protected, became trapped between rumors, expectations of public reaction, and the obligation to maintain a functional image. Crying in silence became the only viable option. Here, a fundamental question arises. Was the emotional reaction a spontaneous response to loss, or the accumulated result of years of forced containment? When a person has learned to constantly repress their emotions so as not to inconvenience the system, any rupture in the structure can provoke a disproportionate collapse. Continuous weeping, persistent fear, and social withdrawal do not appear out of nowhere. They are signs of an exhausted mind. The indirect testimonies that began to circulate described an intelligent, careful woman, always alert. It was not about someone reckless or impulsive, but about a person who had learned to measure every step. That hypervigilance, far from protecting her, kept her in a state of constant anxiety. Living like this implies assuming that danger is not always visible, but it is always possible. At this point, it is relevant to analyze the possible hidden motivators. Fear does not only come from explicit threats. It is often born from ambiguity, from not knowing exactly what is expected of one, from intuiting that any mistake can have irreversible consequences. In highly centralized systems, where power is exercised opaquely, uncertainty becomes an extremely effective tool of control. The narrative that was later constructed around her situation reflects precisely that atmosphere. It does not matter so much if every detail is verifiable, but what is revealed by the fact that so many people considered stories of isolation, coercion, and psychological violence to be plausible. The emotional credibility of these accounts does not arise from concrete proof, but from a shared collective experience, the perception that the system can crush the individual without prior warning. From an analytical perspective, it is necessary to distinguish between confirmed facts and social projections. However, it is also essential to recognize that projections do not appear in a vacuum. They feed on precedents, on previous cases, on a collective memory marked by forced silences and abrupt endings. When the public perceives patterns, they begin to fill the voids with hypotheses that, although unproven, result coherent with their understanding of the environment. The root of the problem, then, does not reside solely in the tragedy of a loss, nor in the emotional fragility of an actress. It is found in the structure that normalizes fear, that penalizes vulnerability, and that converts obedience into the only acceptable form of permanence. Within that framework, artistic sensitivity, far from being a strength, can transform into a risk. Understanding this initial phase is essential to analyze what came after, not as a set of isolated events, but as the logical consequence of a system that pushes its members to the limit and then observes in silence when one of them begins to break. The following phase of the crisis did not unfold in private spaces or controlled conversations, but in the most volatile territory of all, the digital public sphere. When official information is scarce or non-existent, the void does not remain empty for long. It is occupied by interpretations, conjectures, and emotional narratives that expand with a speed impossible to contain. At that moment, the story ceased to belong to those who were living it and passed to be molded by those who observed it from the outside. The initial reactions of the public were ambiguous. A part of the audience expressed immediate compassion, recognizing in the silence and absence signs of suffering. For these observers, the perceived fragility of the actress was not a strategy, but a human consequence of unprocessed loss. Their comments were charged with empathy and an almost protective need to understand what had really happened. However, another current interpreted the same indications in the opposite way. The lack of clear statements generated suspicion. In a media environment accustomed to quick explanations and closed narratives, silence was read as evasion or manipulation. This polarization did not arise from verifiable data, but from deeply rooted cultural expectations. The public expects answers, and when they do not receive them, they construct their own. The speed with which these interpretations propagated was amplified by digital platforms that privilege emotionally intense content. Each indirect testimony, each memory rescued from the past, each reinterpreted image acquired a new meaning. Old photographs were analyzed as if they contained hidden messages. Neutral gestures transformed into proofs of something unspoken. The narrative began to feed itself. In this context, voices emerged claiming to possess privileged information. Stories presented as personal revelations or extraordinary experiences found a receptive audience, not necessarily because they were verifiable, but because they offered a coherent structure to explain the collective bewilderment. When reality turns out to be incomprehensible, alternative explanations acquire a particular appeal. The media impact of these versions was immediate. The public image of the actress, until then associated with sobriety and professionalism, became trapped in a narrative frame from which it was almost impossible to escape. Any appearance, any prolonged silence, even total absence, was interpreted as implicit confirmation of some of the hypotheses in circulation. The real person disappeared behind the story others were telling about her. The professional consequences were not long in manifesting. In an industry that depends on predictability and image control, uncertainty is perceived as a risk. Potential projects were put on hold, collaborations were diluted, and public visibility was reduced drastically. It was not about an explicit sanction, but a progressive withdrawal, almost imperceptible, which is usually more effective than any open punishment. From a psychological point of view, this forced isolation intensified the sensation of vulnerability. Being the object of constant debate without the possibility of actively intervening in the conversation generates a particular form of anguish. The observed person loses the capacity to define their own narrative and is forced to coexist with versions of themselves that they do not recognize. This phenomenon, widely documented in studies on media exposure, can rapidly erode emotional stability. The division of opinions among followers reflected, in reality, a broader conflict. On one hand, the desire to protect a figure perceived as fragile. On the other, the need to find those responsible and clear explanations. This tension reveals a central paradox of celebrity consumption. Humanity is expected, but absolute transparency is demanded. Vulnerability is tolerated only when it is carefully measured out. In the absence of confirmed data, the debate shifted towards symbolic terrains. The actress ceased to be seen solely as an individual and came to represent something larger, the possible victim of an opaque system, or, for others, a figure wrapped in an exaggerated narrative. In both cases, her personal experience remained subordinate to the function it fulfilled within the collective imagination. The role of unofficial media was crucial at this stage. Independent channels, forums, and live streams became spaces where the story was constantly reinterpreted. Each new version promised to get closer to the truth, but in reality, added new layers of complexity. The accumulation of accounts did not clarify the facts, it made them more diffuse. This phenomenon highlights a recurring pattern in contemporary crises. When information is fragmentary, the public not only consumes narratives, but participates actively in their construction. The line between observer and narrator blurs. The story becomes a collective product, molded by shared fears, previous experiences, and institutional distrust. Ultimately, the initial impact of this media avalanche cannot be measured solely in terms of reputation or professional career. Its deepest effect resides in the transformation of a private life into a symbolic battlefield. The actress, regardless of her real situation, became trapped in a structure that reduced her to a set of external interpretations. This phase did not resolve any of the fundamental questions. On the contrary, it multiplied them. And in that process, it prepared the ground for an even deeper breaking point, where the story would cease to be just an image crisis to become a mirror of the collective anxieties of an entire society. The darkest point of this story did not manifest through a visible scandal or a public confession. It arrived, paradoxically, with absolute silence. When a figure accustomed to existing under the constant gaze of the public disappears without explanation, the void acquires an almost physical weight. There are no new images. There are no words to interpret. Only absence remains, and with it, an unease that expands slowly. In that period, the actress ceased to be an active subject within the narrative. She did not respond. She did not appear. She did not correct versions. From the outside, that immobility was interpreted as a sign of defeat. However, from a human perspective, it can be understood as the result of extreme saturation. When pressure exceeds a certain threshold, even the instinct for self-protection weakens. Withdrawing from the world becomes the only way to continue existing. Isolation, far from offering immediate relief, usually intensifies internal conflicts. The mind, deprived of controllable external stimuli, becomes a space where fears acquire disproportionate proportions. In documented cases of prolonged media exposure, this phenomenon is accompanied by a sensation of loss of identity. The person stops recognizing themselves outside the public image that others have built. In that state, the notion of the future becomes diffuse. It was precisely at that moment when the story definitively transcended the realm of entertainment. Interpretations began to acquire a broader tone, less centered on a concrete person and more focused on the system that surrounded her. The actress came to be seen as a symbol. For some, she represented the fragility of those who do not adjust to the implicit rules of power. For others, she embodied the human cost of an industry that demands absolute obedience in exchange for visibility. This shift in focus marked the true narrative climax. The question ceased to be what exactly had happened to a concrete person and transformed into something much more disturbing. How many similar stories remain hidden because they did not manage to filter into the public space? The case functioned as a catalyst, activating collective memories of other disappearances, other silences, other abrupt endings that were never completely explained. At this point, the accumulation of accounts reached an almost unbearable level. Not because they offered clear answers, but because they evidenced structural distrust. The audience no longer expected official statements as a source of truth. They sought meaning in fragments, in analogies, in shared experiences. This displacement reveals a profound fracture between institutions and public perception, where informational legitimacy is severely eroded. The story then acquired a reflective dimension. Beyond its factual veracity, it forced many to confront an uncomfortable reality: the normalization of fear and control as part of the daily landscape. When a society assumes that certain questions must not be asked, and that certain answers will never arrive, speculation ceases to be a marginal act and becomes a mechanism of psychological survival. In the midst of this atmosphere, the absent figure of the actress functioned as a mirror. Each interpretation projected the fears of the one formulating it. For some, it was proof that the system punishes difference. For others, a warning about the limits of public exposure. In both cases, her story ceased to belong to her. It was absorbed by a collective conversation that completely overwhelmed her. The moment of greatest intensity was not marked by a concrete revelation, but by a realization. The understanding that, regardless of the individual outcome, the underlying problem persisted. The lack of transparency, the silent pressure, the instrumentalization of people as replaceable pieces were realities that could not be ignored once exposed, even if indirectly. This process produced a form of uncomfortable enlightenment. It offered neither comfort nor closure, but it did offer a bitter clarity. The story demonstrated that the true conflict does not reside in a single act of violence or coercion, but in the accumulation of small daily resignations, resigning to speak, to question, to show oneself vulnerable. When these resignations are normalized, the damage becomes structural. Upon reaching this point, the narrative could no longer go back. The actress, present or absent, real or symbolic, had triggered a reflection that transcended her personal destiny. Her story became a reminder that the cost of maintaining certain structures is not paid only with reputations, but with human lives, silenced emotions, and truncated futures. This climax did not resolve the mystery, but it did transform the public's gaze. What began as an individual crisis ended up revealing a broader truth. When power operates without accountability, even silence becomes a form of violence. And recognizing that reality, although painful, is the first step toward any possibility of change. The outcome of this story offers neither a clear resolution nor a definitive answer. There is no final statement that restores calm, nor confirmation that closes the debate. What remains, instead, is a persistent echo, a sensation of unease that settles both in those who followed the case and in those who preferred to look away. In that prolonged silence is found, paradoxically, the deepest meaning of everything that occurred. With the passage of time, the figure of the actress ceased to occupy the center of the media stage, but her absence continued to resonate. Not as a specific memory, but as a latent warning. Her story transformed into an involuntary symbol of the risks that any individual faces when the logic of the system prevails over personal dignity. It is not solely about fame, contracts, or visibility, but about the capacity to exist without fear within a framework that rarely shows its true face. The consequences of this crisis are not limited to an interrupted career or an eroded reputation. They extend toward a collective reflection on the fragility of public figures and on the shared responsibility between industry, media, and audience. When the consumption of information prioritizes speed over veracity and emotion over verification, the damage multiplies silently. No one remains completely on the sidelines. This case also highlights an uncomfortable truth. Power does not always need to manifest explicitly to be effective. It often operates through ambiguity, implicit pressure, and the normalization of fear. In that context, silence is not neutral. It can be a strategy of self-protection, but also a direct consequence of structures that discourage any form of dissent or vulnerability. The lesson that emerges from this story is not limited to the sphere of entertainment. It is a broader warning about the fragility of individual rights when they are subordinate to opaque interests. It invites one to question to what extent a society is willing to accept the absence of clear answers, and how much it is willing to sacrifice in the name of stability or apparent order. Looking toward the future, the question is no longer what exactly happened in this specific case, but what changes are necessary to prevent similar stories from repeating. Transparency, the protection of mental health, and the creation of spaces where vulnerability is not penalized remain pending challenges. Without these elements, any system runs the risk of devouring those who sustain it. This story does not pretend to offer an absolute truth, nor impose a unique interpretation. Its value resides in the capacity to generate questions, to discomfort, and to force a deeper reflection. Because In the end, it is not just about an actress nor an isolated episode, but about the way a society decides to look, or not look, at what happens when the show turns off and only the real person remains, with their fears, their silence, and their humanity.